Okay, Tom Martin, our next speaker, the tallest man ever to address one of these organizations before. Tom has been a friend of mine since the mid-90s. It was 94 when we first met at a Chesterton Society conference in Milwaukee. He told a wonderful story of how he first read Orthodoxy while he was driving a tractor and drinking a six-pack. And he's a philosophy professor at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, and he looks like a philosophy professor, especially when you look up. I'm not going to tell any more tall jokes, Tom, because they're not funny. And nobody thinks that tall people are funny either, so it kind of goes together. But he has spoken at several of our American Chesterton Society conferences. But the very first talk I ever heard him give was on Russian literature. It was on Dostoevsky in Chesterton. And to hear him speak now on Solzhenitsyn is going to be a real treat. So please welcome Tom Martin.
Thank you so much. It's so fond of me to come back to Western New York. I moved here when I was a kid. I grew up in South America. My father took a job at the University of New York at Fredonia. And I had a similar birth defect when I was a child. I was 6'6" when I was 17 years old. And I walked into Fredonia High School my first day in America. I had left when I was 8 years old and came back to Fredonia High School, and I walked in the door the first day, and the basketball coach almost mounted me in the lobby. By 2 o'clock, he had me after school in the gym to see what I could do. And little did he know, I grew up playing soccer and baseball, never played any basketball at all. But they had me on the bench for most of the year, and I eventually left. But at the end of my senior year, he offered me, he said, you know, Tom, because you went to school in South America, you get another year's eligibility, so you can come back to high school. So I thought about that in a minute, and the Vietnam War was going on. It was 1967, so after hearing that, the next day I went down and enlisted in the Air Force. Where I played some great basketball with the kids from Brooklyn and the Bronx and Philly and Watts. But it's good to be back to Western New York. I love the green. I live in a cornfield. I left this morning. I felt like Bilbo in the dark. Left yesterday morning at 2 o'clock and drove to Lincoln. Then I wandered into Chicago. And I wanted to practice my paper, and there was no place to practice. But then I looked around. Somebody was elbowing me in my side as I sat there. And it was a fellow beside me, about 30 years old, was playing a video game. He was going like this across the screen. And everybody else was on a machine. So I stood up and I read my paper in the concourse to get ready to come here, and nobody heard a word. It was a great audience, people rushing by. As Gogol said, I was amongst the dead souls, is what I was amongst. But they were amusing themselves, and all were quite pleased, saying, my precious. My precious. Oh. I'd like to thank Lou and Jean for the hospitality, for having me back. You never know when they ask you once if they're ever going to bring you back, you know. Thank God I'm with Christians. But anyway, G.K. Chesterton was lecturing on Dante at California Millbrook Junior College when a woman who had lost her place in a volume of Dante called out, "Where the hell are we?" The class laughed. Thank you. But Mr. Chesterton took the interruption with good humor, saying, I rather like that phrase. Good Catholic expression. A Catholic doesn't live in Millbrook or in England, but in subspecies aeternitatis. What the hell does that mean? Never people quote Latin, and they're never going to tell you what it means. Well, I'm not either. And the question always is, where in the hell are we? Or, where in heaven are we? Or, where in purgatory are we? We live in that spaceless, timeless commonwealth. And the question is very important. In order to understand where in the hell are we in this spaceless, timeless commonwealth in which we live, we are all, after all, living souls bound for eternity. Let's locate our coordinates so we have a place from which to start. Being a man of hope, I suggest we are in the first circle of Dante's Inferno of the Divine Comedy. I am not a cartographer of souls, so I defer to Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his work in the first circle to shed light on the landscape of our present condition. Solzhenitsyn uses Dante's Inferno as a point from which to measure life and hell on earth of the Soviet Union under Stalin, midway through the 20th century. Like Dante in the Inferno, he is both the author of the work and a pilgrim in the work. Dante begins his journey by praising his mentor Virgil. You are my true master and first author, the soul maker from whom I drew the breath, of that sweet style whose measure hath brought me honor. See there, immortal sage, the beast I flee. For my soul's salvation, I beg you, guard me from her. For she has struck a mortal tremor through me. It was Dante speaking about concupiscence, which is chasing him. Solzhenitsyn awoke like Dante, midway through his life to find himself in hell, as one of the millions of living souls in Stalin's prison camps known as the Gulag. Solzhenitsyn, after World War II, spent 5 years in a Gulag and 7 years in exile. Death could scarcely be more bitter than that place, echoing Dante. And he could easily have let his indignation boil over into his work. However, he said in the Oak and the Calf, but I would not allow that either, because the laws of poetry command us to rise above our anger and to try to see the present and the light of eternity. Or as Chesterton would say, sub species eternitatis, from the perspective of the eternity, from the perspective of the eternal, how God would see it. To show us his and every man's plight in the light of the eternal, Solzhenitsyn uses Dante's 4 levels of interpretations of Christian allegory. The goal of Christian allegory is to convey multiple levels of truth through polysemantic writing, that is, writing with multiple senses or meanings. Dante explains the 4 levels in a letter to Lord Congrande de Salca. How's that sound, Dale? Got it? Congrande con Salca. But anyway, the vicar general of the participant of the Holy Roman Empire in the town of Verona, which is meant to help him read the Divine Comedy by using the deliverance of Israel from Egypt as an example. This is from Dante. If we look at it from the letter alone, it means to us the exit of the children of Israel from Egypt at the time of Moses. If from allegory, it means for us our redemption done by Christ. If from the moral sense, it means to us the conversion of the soul from the struggle and the misery of sin to the status of grace. If from the anagogical, it means the leave-taking of the blessed soul from the slavery of this corruption to the freedom of eternal glory. And through these mystical senses they're called by various names. In general, all can be called allegorical because they are different from the literal or the historical. The end of the Christian allegory is to show the conversion of the soul from the struggle and misery of sin to the status of grace, from the slavery of corruption to the freedom of eternal glory. In the novel, The First Circle, it is set in the Marvino, a former estate church that is now called a sharaska. Sharaska is Russian slang for a sinister enterprise based on a bluff or deceit. It is being used as a special prison outside of Moscow in 1949, a time in which Stalin lords over an expansive penal system. The novel focuses upon falsely accused and imprisoned mathematicians, physicists, chemists, radio and telephonic engineers, artists, translators, architects, and the like, as well as free employees, guards, ministers, while Stalin himself is lodged in an icy, bulletproof office near the Kremlin, reminding us of Satan, who is at the core of the frozen shell of hell. The scientists in the Sharaska are working on an encoder as a special project for Stalin. This is a machine for reading voice prints, which, if successful, will revolutionize state security as the science of fingerprints has revolutionized criminal investigation. It is something the NSA might be interested in assuming that such an invention is not already dated. If the scientists are successful in their research, they will be allowed to return to their wives. In his work, Solzhenitsyn raises the question as to whether the scientist as scientist can rise above the level of using his superior intellectual power for the privilege of a laboratory and a research institution to the moral level in which the good of intellect is not forsaken. The period of the novel is 3 days, starting on Christmas Eve, 1949. We are introduced to the idea of the first circle by a scientist who has recently arrived from a different prison in the bowels of the Gulag from Siberia, in a conversation with Lev Rubin, who is a Jewish Marxist philologist. Do you know, Lev, this rush of impressions, this change of scenery is making my head spin. I lived 52 years, recovered twice from fatal illnesses, been married twice to rather pretty women, fathered sons, been published in 7 languages, received academic prizes, and never have I been so blissfully happy as today. What a place to think that tomorrow I won't be driven into icy water. I'll get 40 grams of butter. There'll be black bread on the tables. Books aren't forbidden. You can shave yourself. Guards don't beat zeks, which is the Russian for prisoners. What a great day. What radiant heights. Maybe I'm dead. Maybe I'm dreaming. I feel as though I'm in heaven. Lev Rubin assures him that he is not in heaven. You are just as you previously were in hell. But you have risen to its best and highest circle, the first circle. You ask what a sharaska is? Let's say the concept of a sharaska was brought up by Dante. Remember that Dante tore his hair trying to decide where to put the wise men of ancient times. It was a Christian's duty to toss those pagans into hell. But the Renaissance consciousness couldn't reconcile itself to the idea of enlightened men being packed in with all sorts of sinners and condemned to physical torture. So Dante thought up a special place for them in hell. It is ironic for Rubin to compare the sharaska to the first circle. Dante's creation of the first circle is not a bluff or a deceit like the sharaska. Nevertheless, this is to be expected of Lev Rubin, who besides being a Marxist is a Jewish philologist. Philology literally means the lover of words, and is the study of written texts, especially ancient ones. While studying the origins of words, Rubin, as a linguist, denies the originator of the word, the logos, of God, of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. He cuts the spirit out of the word. Furthermore, as a Hebrew, he denies the word that was made flesh. Given Dante's 4 levels of interpretation, the literal and the allegorical, Rubin never rises beyond a literal and historical interpretation of his surroundings. At this point, Rubin explains the Inferno as a product of Renaissance consciousness and not the creation of the poet Dante. He gives a Marxist analysis of history that being the evolution of class consciousness, in which human beings are byproducts of modes of productions, of a specific social, historical, and economic condition. Man is not made in the image of God. Rubin's explanation reminds us of George Lukács's definition of class consciousness. Regarded abstractly and formally, class consciousness implies a class-conditioned unconsciousness of one's own social, historical, and economic conditions. The condition is given as a definitional structural relationship, a definite formal nexus which appears to govern the whole of life. This definition is beaten down into a slogan throughout the novel, and it appears in the expression, being determines consciousness. In other words, whatever I just said, the academic language just loses you, doesn't it? What did he just say? Basically, he said, man is a reflection of a social construct, a shadow of his material surroundings. You are just a shadow of the world around you. You have no core, you have no content. You're a reflection of your economic conditions. Rubin's explanation of the first circle is indicative of one who has lost the good of intellect. In Dante's Inferno, when Dante walks past the gates of hell into the city of woe, Virgil says to him, "This is the place I told you to expect. Here you shall pass among the fallen people, souls who have lost the good of intellect." When Dante enters into the first circle of hell, he is in limbo and is confronted by a radiance that struck away a hemisphere of dark. The radiance is emanating from the intellectuals of the virtuous pagans of antiquity, who were born without the light of Christ's revelation, and therefore they cannot come into the light of God. They are not tormented. Their only pain is they have no hope. It is here that Plato, Socrates, Thales, and other virtuous pagans are centered on Aristotle, the master of those who know. The virtuous pagans of the first circle are the expressions of a just life, who desired eternal goodness in a world with only a murmur of immortality. They are spared the fire and sufferings of hell in one affliction only, that without hope we live on in desire. Reuben is not a virtuous pagan who was born before Christ, and is in fact, there can no longer be any virtuous pagans living without hope of salvation. Reuben gropes in darkness for a material explanation of his being, which is a reflection of the ground to which he has fallen. In fact, calling the prison the first circle is a deceit being played on Reuben, an atheist who thinks science can replace God, and the scientist has replaced the priest in the Marvino, which used to be in a state church, the former state church in which he is now lodged. Solzhenitsyn pairs Lev Rubin with the character Gleb Nersin. Now, as Dante is the pilgrim and the author of the Inferno, Nersin is the pilgrim and the author of In the First Circle. Solzhenitsyn, in describing Nersin, describes himself. Though he is a mathematician, he was no stranger to linguistics. And from the time of the sounds of Russian speech had become a research project at the Marvino Scientific Research Institution, he had paired himself off with the only philologist there, which is Rubin. So he has these two philologists tied together in a project. For the past 2 years, they've been sitting back to back, 12 hours a day, working on the encoder. Before prison, both were frontline soldiers who had been arrested on the Northwest Front, as well as on the Belarusian front. Both had a proper collection of war decorations. Both were arrested at the front in the same month by the same SMERSH unit, and both had received a 10-year sentence. They are reflections of the same circumstances, the expression of their material surroundings, and the doctrine of being, which supposedly determines consciousness. Nersin is like Solzhenitsyn, like Dante the Pilgrim. He has awoken to find himself in the dark wood of the materialist. as he has transcended his immediate surroundings and has risen, in his own words, to a stage of development where the bad begins to appear good. Nersen is passing through hell and is protected, though he does not see this, by grace, to learn the will of God manifest in the divine order of justice. Though he does not literally have Virgil to lead him through hell, Nersen has not lost the good of intellect. Like Lev Rubin, the Marxist materialist, has, and this will allow him to understand the logos of the living word as he searches for truth to guide his life. Nersen represents the converse of the idea that being determines consciousness, because he is a living example of a man who allows his conscience to determine his being. Listen as Nersen speaks to Lev Rubin. When I was free, I used to read books in which wise men pondered the meaning of life or the nature of happiness. I understood very little of those passages. I gave them their due. Wise men are supposed to think. It's their profession. But the meaning of life, we live. That's the meaning. Happiness, when things are going well, that's happiness. Everyone knows that. Thank God for prison. It gave me the chance to think. In order to understand the nature of happiness, we must first have to analyze satiety. Remember the Lubyanka? That's a prison in Moscow where Solzhenitsyn was taken there when they first interrogated them after they've arrested them. And the counterintelligence. Remember that thin, watery barley or the oatmeal porridge without a single drop of fat. Can you say that you eat it? No. You commune with it. You take it like a sacrament, like the prana of yogis. You eat it slowly. You eat it from the tip of the wooden spoon. You eat it, absorb it entirely in the process of eating and thinking about eating, and it spreads through your body like nectar. You tremble at the sweetness released from those overcooked little grains and the murky liquid they float in. And then, with hardly any nourishment, you go on living. 6 months, 12 months. Can you really compare the crude devouring of a steak with this? So in our own poor hides and from our own miserable comrades, we learn the nature of satiety. Satiety depends not at all on how much we eat, but on how we eat. It's the same with happiness, the very same. Lev, friend, happiness doesn't depend on how many external blessings we have snatched from life. It depends on our attitude towards them. There is a saying in the Taoist ethics, whoever is capable of contentment will always be satisfied. Notice how Nersen, with the light of human intellect, is like one of the wise men centered on Aristotle in the first circle. He sees at this point in the novel as far as reason can see without revelation. However, unlike the virtuous pagans who lived before Christ, Nersen is living in the light of the living Word, Christ. Christ's ascension into heaven and the defeat of death. Rubin responds to Nersen, "You're an eclectic. You pluck bright feathers from nowhere." Nersen fires back, "Don't try to mix things up, Lev. That's not how it is at all. I draw my conclusions not from philosophy I've read, but from the stories about real people that I've heard in prison. And afterwards, when I have to formulate my own conclusions, why should I discover America all over again? I leaf through the ancient philosophers and find my newest discoveries there. Don't interrupt." I was about to give an example. If in the camp, and even more so in a Sharaska, there should be a miracle, like a free, non-working Sunday, then in the course of the day, the soul unfreezes. And even though nothing in my external situation has changed for the better, still the yoke of prison has let up a bit, and I have a real conversation or a real honest page, and I'm on the crest of a wave. I'm weightless, suspended, disembodied. I lie there on my upper bunk and stare at the ceiling. It's very close. It's bare. The plasterwork is bad, and I tremble with the utter joy of existence. I fall asleep in perfect bliss. No president, or prime minister can fall asleep so satisfied with this Sunday. Reuben, true to his dogma, counters with, "Take heed, youngster. There speaks in you the immaturity of a youthful mind. You prefer your personal experiences to the collective experiences of humanity. Intelligence is objectivity. Get your head out of the sand. Look at things from their historical perspective. Natural law, do you understand the meaning of that term? Inevitable, condition, natural law. Everything follows its inevitable course. And it's useless to root around for some kind of rotten skepticism. A man's personal experiences are only an illusion. There is only the historical perspective of class conscious, set to natural law of everything following its inevitable course. From this natural law, Reuben justifies their being in prison. What must be, must be. The state can't exist without a well-organized penal system. He further argues that Stalin is the greatest. Someday you will understand. He's the Robespierre, the Napoleon of our revolution, wrapped up in one. He is wise. He really is. He sees beyond to what can possibly be seen. Ironically, while justifying the necessity of history, which is everything following its inevitable course, Reuben thinks there's been a mistake when he, a devout communist, was wrongly sent to prison. He spends his day writing many letters to party officials, pleading his case. But he remains true to Marx's natural law, inevitably imprisoned. It is not a question of whether or not a man has a soul. All men are God's work. That's a given. The question is whether matter precedes mind or mind preceded matter. Reuben's deterministic natural law is the converse of St. Augustine's natural law, in which he states, humans participate in the eternal law of God by using reason in conformity with the natural law to discern what is good and what is evil. It's an act of conscience. Therefore, the end of man is to be virtuous, though he is free to be unnatural and think himself a material creature. From observation through science, he will find there is no virtue in nature, where everything follows its inevitable course, where human beings as animals can feed on one another. Nerson turns from his argument with Reuben and is brought face to face with Peter Trompovich Veranov, one of his former teachers from the university. While both are seated in the Colonel of Engineers Yakhanov's office, Yakhanov leaves the teacher with his former student. Nerson looks upon him and sees, I quote, a pale man whose glasses glittered with reflected light, who seemed to be a ghost unlawfully returned from a forgotten world. In other words, another tempter from hell of the materialistic world. Nevertheless, he is a ghost who can help Nerson, as Veranov has been sent to the Sharaska. Remember, it's a bluff or a deceit, to intensify and the systematic, the cartography work. And he is delighted to find that a former student whose prospects had always been bright is there to assist him. Nerson is tempted by the opportunity to stay in the first circle and work on cryptography when he reflects upon the circumstances of his immediate being. 14 hours a day, no days off, and no breaks. Heads crammed with theories of probability, theories of numbers, theories of error, a dead brain, a dried out soul. What would be left to think with? What would be left for learning about life? For a moment he hesitates and examines the circumstances. There is meat at dinner, butter on his bread. Hands are not flayed from work. Fingers are not frozen. No lying down on boards. Here he lies down in a bed under white sheets and feels contentment. Then the good of intellect. The divine light shines in his soul and he asks, but why live a whole life just to be living, just to keep the body going? precious comfort. What do we need it for if there's nothing else? And good sense told him, yes, it would be better to stay in these circumstances, but the heart said, get thee behind me, Satan. True to Dante's Christian allegory, we as readers witness the conversion of the soul from the struggle and misery of sin to the status of grace, from the salvation of corruption to the freedom of eternal glory, which Nersin doesn't see. Colonel Yakinov returns to find Nersin refusing to work with his former teacher in the first circle. The colonel tells him, you have traded the nectar of the gods for lentil soup, and makes a note that Nersin is to be sent back to the Gulag. All of this takes place at the beginning of the novel, which ends with Nersin being thrown out of the first circle and shipped back to Siberia, the depths of hell where he expects to die. However, Nersin sees that for his soul's sake, he must leave the first circle of the Marxists, reserved for the scientists who as priests are set to subject nature to Stalin's will, and he must throw himself into the abyss of the Gulag if he is ever going to find himself for his soul's sake. Before he takes this leap of faith, he is granted an unexpected visit from his wife. His serving in World War II and his time in the camps has separated them, and now he is being sentenced to the Gulag will continue their separation. Once in prison, he loses his rights as a Soviet Union, of a Soviet citizen, and his wife is equally an enemy of the state unless she renounces her husband, which Nadia has not done. Instead, she pretends to be a single woman who does not wear her wedding ring for fear of being expelled from the university where she is working on a master's degree. She cannot successfully complete her research until she completes an 8-page application, which has to be handed into the personnel department by the following Tuesday of her visit with Gleb. The inconsistency she knows in her application will certainly flag her as an enemy of the state. Their visit is in a room with a guard standing between them. They are not allowed to kiss or to touch one another. If they do, the visit is terminated. He tells her it would be good if she sought a divorce for her own sake, as he does not expect to return. She asks where he is being moved to. He replies, don't be surprised if they move me to somewhere long away from here and let her stop altogether. Might they? Where to? God knows. Don't tell me you started believing in God. Gleb smiles. Why not? Pascal, Newton, Einstein. The guard immediately shouts, you were told not to mention names. Your visit is terminated. Gleb reaches out and embraces his wife and kisses her and says with great tenderness, do whatever is best for you. I shall always. But he doesn't finish the sentence as the guard yells, I'm terminating the visit. Nadia, back towards the door, waving goodbye to her husband, with fingers on one raised hand, a hand without a ring. After his visit with Nadia, before going deeper into hell, Nersin wants to be alone. On the way back into the Sharaska, he gets off the prison transport bus and decides to take the back stairs into the building, which leads to the camp artist, Kondrashov Iovna's studio. Ivanov, has no connection with the general work of the Sharaska. He's the camp artist, where he is kept on as a sort of serf artist to paint portraits of generals and scientists for the vestibules and walls of the main building. And the translator uses the word vestibule. And those of you who are familiar with Dante's Inferno, the vestibule is where the souls first go into hell. And the vestibule is housed with the people who refuse to choose good and evil. So they're housed there because God doesn't want them, and they're too paltry even for the devil to want them, because they wouldn't make up their mind. And their punishment is a contrapasso, which means the punishment has to be fitting the sin. So what you see is these characters, their eyes are filled with flies and oozing out of their eyes, and there's maggots in their eyes and flies, and the oozing goes over their face and drips down to their feet. And the punishment is they're faceless. They have no name. They didn't pick up their identities. So God and the devil both refused them. And that's where the paintings are lined in the hallway. Just one word, but if you've read Christian allegory, you see more than you're told. You see more than you're told. And all the time we're living in that allegory because we're in God's book. We're in God's creation. So I'm in a nave, I'm in a bark right now, I'm in an up-down ship with Christ on the walls and Mary, Queen of Heaven, looking at me right there with her son from her most precious womb, the tabernacle. It's the womb of Christ, and we are tabernacles right in this room this minute. So I'm speaking on sacred ground. Those are things, if you see them, you see them, and they're gifts. There's a play the whole time going on, and the light's at work in our lives. But you have to open up your eyes. You have to jump out of hell. On his way up the steps, he passes a canvas commissioned for the vestibule of the main building. A.S. Popov demonstrates the first radio telegraph to Admiral Makarov. The picture he painted were big and cost nothing, but beautiful they were not. He has his own work, what he does, which is hanging there. He turned up the last flight. He's going up to the third floor on the back stairs, the last flight, and he has his art studio right on the landing. And before him on a blank wall hangs the painting, The Blasted Oak, a solitary, twisted oak rooted on a cliff being blasted by the winds, which for some reason none of the artist's patrons wanted. Next to this was Moscow 1941, which depicted a girl in an anti-gas suit, the dark gray anti-gas suit with its stiff creases and silvery glint were like the light folds and the looks like on a suit of armor. She was ready for battle. Kondrastov had obviously seen Joan of Arc. He meets the artist, who is not altogether pleased to see a visitor, as his work requires solitude and silence. Nevertheless, he greets Nersin, who tells him he has not come to visit, but to be quiet for a bit. And then leans against the banister before the landing to remember his wife, as the artist returned to the same spot on the painting on which he was working. In contemplation, Nersin reawakens affection for his wife. He felt as though his fingers, where they had touched her hands, her neck, her hair in farewell, were dusted with some precious pollen. He could not remember or imagine any fault in his wife. She had all the virtues, and above all, loyalty. Then he looked up at the blasted oak and said to Kondrastov, "I don't understand your passion for hyperbole. All the hurricanes that ever blew anywhere in the last 200 years have passed this way, twisted in branches and struggling to claw to loose it from the cliff. You're a Shakespearean. Of course, anything evil must be inordinately evil. Statistically, very few people find themselves in such a situation." The artist waved his long arms. Angrily, "I can't listen to such stuff. Evil is ancient history, you say? Evil never really put in an appearance before our century? We ought to spell good and evil, not just with capital letters, but letters 5 stories high. Statistically few? What about you and me and the rest of us here? How many millions are like us?" Nersin, "If we're in camp and we're invited to sell whatever conscience we have left for 200 grams of black bread, Kondrastov, prison camp should never break a man's spirit." Shouldn't perhaps, but it does. As everyone knows, being determines consciousness. No, no, no. That would be too degrading. If that were true, life would not be worth living. If that were so, why do lovers remain faithful to each other when they're parted? Being demands that they be unfaithful. Nersin thinks his experience of life was worth more than that of the aged idealist. Kondrastov continues, "Every human being is born with a sort of inner essence. It is, so to speak, the innermost core of man, his essential self. No being, nothing extraneous, can determine him. Moreover, every man carries within himself an image of perfection, which is never dimmed and which sometimes stands out with remarkable clarity and reminds him of his chivalrous duty. Nersin shoots back. Why do you go in for all these knights and their knightly trappings? You seem too far off. Your anti-aircraft girl is a knight in armor. The artist. What? You don't like it? I go too far? Who was it that expelled the knights from our lives? Lovers of money and trade? Lovers of orgies and feasting? What is it our age most lacks? Party members? No, sir. It lacks knights. Do you know who Parsifal was? Wasn't he connected with Lonegran? His father, the guardian of the Holy Grail, the artist goes on. I try to visualize that precise moment, the moment any man may experience when he first catches sight of the image of perfection. Kondrashov points to the wall where he had been working when Nersin had interrupted him. Here, look at a sketch for the most important picture of my life, says Kondrashov Inovna. The moment Parsifal first catches sight of the castle of the Holy Grail. Nersin turns and focuses on the painting upon which Kondrashov is intently looking and sees the following, which I will let Solzhenitsyn paint before your eyes. In shape, the picture was twice as high as it was long. It showed a wedge-shaped ravine dividing two mountain crags. Above them, both to the right and left, could just be seen the outermost trees of a forest, a dense, primeval forest, some creeping ferns, some ugly, menacing penitentials, thickets clung to the very edge, and even to the overhanging face of the rock. Above and to the left, a pale gray horse was coming out of the forest, ridden by a man in helmet and a cape. Unafraid of the abyss, the horse had raised its foreleg before taking the final leap, prepared as its rider commanded to gather itself and jump over, a leap that was well within his power. But the rider was not looking at the chasm that faced the horse. Dazed, wondering, he was looking into the middle distance, where the upper reaches of the sky were suffused with an orange-gold radiance, which might have been from the sun or something else even more brilliantly hidden from view by a castle. Walled and turreted, growing out of the ledges of the mountainside, visible also from below, the gap between the crags, between the ferns and trees, rising to a needle point at the top of the picture, indistinct in outline, as though woven from gently shimmering clouds, yet still vaguely discernible in all the details of its unearthly perfection. Enveloped in a shining and lilac-colored aureole stood the castle of the Holy Grail. Kondrashov's painting of his knight looking at the castle of the Holy Grail, enveloped in a shining and lilac color on a horse who was waiting his command to jump over the abyss, is showing Nersin, his own inner essence with which every human being is born, which he carries within himself, that which is made in the image of perfection, which sometimes stands out with remarkable clarity, and all of us are reminded of our chivalrous duty. This epiphany is exactly what Nersin needed before he leaps from the first circle into hell. That of the unvirtuous pagans who are held captive by mammon, by meat at dinner, butter on their bread, and sheets on their bed, while they work on projects to entrap the enemies of the state and send them into the lower circles of hell. At the end of the novel, Nersin says goodbye to a fellow prisoner who tries to get him to stay on to work on the encoder. He responds like a chivalrous knight, "I've more or less made up my mind to try and experiment. There's a proverb that says, it's not the sea that drowns you, it's the puddle. I want to try to dive into the sea." This is Nerson's leap of faith to embrace the unknown suffering that awaits him in the lower circles of hell, where he will be comforted by the image of perfection which is within his soul. Nerson is not angry, nor is Solzhenitsyn angry, because the laws of poetry command us to rise above our anger and to try to see the present in the light of eternity. And as G.K. Chesterton would say, a good Catholic expression, where the hell are we? Thank you.